Chapter 121. Karkaroff Learns to Cook. April 18, 1996, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Great Britain Horcruxes left. 5. Tierra, Larket, Ring, Snake, Cup, Igor Karkaroff looked out at the gates to the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. At least everybody knew who he was now. He had gained a significant amount of name recognition during the previous year, when he had brought a few talented men to Hogwarts to compete in the Triwizard Tournament. Karkaroff was fairly certain, however, that Crumb would represent Durmstrang, and he wasn't disappointed. Crumb had performed well, completing all of his tasks. However, even Victor himself wasn't entirely certain what had happened to him in the maze during the third task. The talented Bulgarian seeker had meant to speak with Karkaroff after the task had been completed. However, everyone's plans had been disrupted when Harry Potter had materialized with the Triwizard Cup, a dead competitor, and a warning that Voldemort had returned. Karkaroff had gotten very nervous when he had heard that Voldemort had returned. He couldn't deny that something had happened. The dark mark on his arm had burned a few minutes before Harry had reappeared with the cup. He had gotten to know all 4 contestants during the tournament, and none of them seemed to be the type to kill one of their opponents in order to reach the cup first. Once the students had been ruled out, the only reasonable thing which could have killed Cedric would have been an obstacle in the maze, and Karkaroff knew that couldn't have happened. This meant that Cedric had been murdered by someone who had not been involved with the tournament. Death Eaters certainly qualified for that role, with a revived Voldemort himself at the top of the list. Karkaroff had bolted at the first opportunity. He had been on the run for almost a year now, evading curses and Death Eaters whenever he could. He had breathed a sigh of relief when the Quiddler reported that Voldemort had been killed and that most of the Death Eaters had been taken out. However, Karkaroff was familiar enough with the dark arts to suspect that the Dark Lord had taken out Horcruxes and wouldn't be an easy target. He'd survived the attack on Harry back in 1981, after all. As long as Death Eaters had survived the attack, it would always be possible for Voldemort to be revived. Lucius and Wormtail certainly knew how to do it, and they were supposedly still at large. And he hadn't considered the Death Eaters who hadn't been British. De Knoll, Dilmy, Kurosawa, and so forth. He'd heard rumors that Dilmy had resurfaced and was running Al-Qaeda. If that were the case, both the Muggle and Wizarding worlds would be in deep trouble. The Super Bowl breach had opened another possible avenue of escape for him, hiding out with the Muggles. He'd moved into a Muggle neighborhood, far away from prying magical eyes. However, the Death Eaters had still managed to track him down there. He remembered the sneakoscope going off and heading into the storm cellar. When he had emerged half an hour later and cautiously left the house, no one seemed to have noticed. It looked like he had dodged another hex. He was afraid, however, that his luck was running out. He highly doubted that Voldemort would let him back in after betraying Crouch Jr. and several other Death Eaters a few years ago. If Voldemort had returned and had set his sights on Muggle power, the evil mastermind's sphere of influence could expand greatly. The only way he'd be able to beat off the Death Eaters trying to assassinate him would be to ally himself with a stronger power. So here he was, outside Hogwarts. It was a big gamble, trying to get an audience with Dumbledore and ask for his protection. Snape, whom Voldemort presumably knew was now a double agent, seemed to have asked Dumbledore for asylum as well. Dumbledore had accepted Snape and offered him a position at Hogwarts. Could a position at Hogwarts be on the horizon for himself as well? He'd left Durmstrang in the hands of its deputy headmaster, Stanislav Drakel. Despite the name, Stanislav was neither a vampire nor a Death Eater. The Drakels were a well-known magical family, and only a few members had gone to the dark side. Vlad the Impaler, however, had left a legacy which would take his descendants centuries to overcome. Stanislav had routinely warned people that he would duel anyone who dared, discuss both him and Vlad the Impaler in the same breath. The doors of the school were open, as usual. He walked in and started heading for Snape's office. He didn't know Dumbledore's password, and as a result would not be able to get into the headmaster's tower without help. He suspected, however, that Snape would. The potion's master's eyes went wide when he saw Karkaroff. Excusing himself and angrily silencing the students who were reacting excitedly to Karkaroff's presence, he headed outside to speak with Karkaroff. Snape was, as usual, blunt. "Igor, what are you doing here?" Igor shook his head. "I can't talk here. Is your office secure?" Snape nodded. "Yes. However, I cannot talk now. In case you're wondering, I have a class to teach." With that, Snape headed back into the classroom and closed the door in an irritated Karkaroff's face. Severus's reaction had surprised and dismayed Karkaroff. Did Snape not trust him? However, Karkaroff's fear proved to have been a false alarm. As soon as the class ended, Snape headed over to Karkaroff and told Igor to follow him. Snape led Karkaroff into Snape's office and closed the door. "All right, Igor, explain. What brings you over here?" Karkaroff drew a deep breath. "I want to request asylum with Dumbledore. I'm scared and tired of working for Voldemort. He accepted you, and I've already shown my hand by trying to betray Death Eaters while I was in Azkaban. Will he accept me?" "I'll tell him some of the Death Eater secrets, assuming you haven't already told him." Snape stared at him in shock and thought for a moment. "That would be quite helpful, Igor. Be aware, however, that the Dark Lord will not take your defection lightly, and always watch your back whenever you leave the castle." Karkaroff nodded. "I will, Severus. You will have to relinquish control of Durmstrang." "I have, Severus. Drackle is running the show now." "Good. As far as I'm concerned, you're now one of us. There is one complication, however." A lump rose in Karkaroff's throat, and he swallowed deeply. "And that is—" Snape frowned. "Dumbledore is running from the ministry because he instructed a student to use a time-turner 2 years ago. No one knows where he is. Dolores Umbridge, a ministry official, is now headmistress. Let us say that Dumbledore isn't exactly welcome around here for the time being, and that Dolores Umbridge was one of the people who helped convict you as a Death Eater." Karkaroff groaned. "McGonagall? What about McGonagall? Is she around?" Snape nodded. "She is still deputy headmistress. However, McGonagall and I have very little practical power. Umbridge has set herself up as virtual dictator, and everything goes through her. Igor, it appears that the ministry picked a bad year to try to impose its will on the school. Things were bad enough even before Potter showed up in that damned soft drink commercial. Now things are worse." Karkaroff hoped he wasn't sounding whiny. "Can I talk to you and McGonagall? Do you have a safe house which I can stay at until Dumbledore comes back or Voldemort is overthrown?" Snape hesitated. "As a matter of fact, I do. However, it is not up to me to tell you where the safe house is. A particular aura is secret keeper for its location. You will have to go through him and convince him that you are indeed defecting and not trying to become a Trojan horse." Karkaroff bit his lip. "Until you get permission to send me into the safe house, can I stay at Hogwarts? Is there anything I can do here to help the school while we're waiting?" Snape grinned. "I suppose you could help out in the kitchens, Igor. Voldemort would never think to look there, and even if he did manage to get into Hogwarts, he'd presumably go after me." Karkaroff stared at Snape. "The kitchens? I can't cook well. Besides, what happened to the elves who were supposed to run the kitchens?" Snape chuckled. "Oh, the elves are still there. But humans rarely go down there, so it would be a safe place for you to hide until this passes. Besides, you've got a wand. People can learn to cook pretty quickly in an emergency." Chapter 122. Antichrist Speaks on British Television. April 21, 1996. Church of the Right-Wing Westboro, Kansas, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cups. Stephen Pitmoss prided himself on the notices announcing his sermons outside the church. He had had a few good ones over the years. However, he had been fairly certain that today's would probably be one of the most effective advertising gimmicks he'd ever thought up. Antichrist speaks on British television. Pitmos had nearly fallen over in a dead faint when one of his college hires had shown him the footage, recorded from a British student's television set and placed on the internet. Why him? He was but one man, and although he had a devoted following, he didn't think he was adequate for the task he had been chosen to undertake. How would he be able to lead his flock through the 7 years of tribulation? Although it was obvious that God had selected Pitmos to be one of the lucky few to make it through to the second coming, he had not yet provided him with the knowledge necessary to convince the masses and tell everyone that they needed to repent and do so quickly. This would likely be Pitmos's greatest trial, comparable to those of Abraham, Jesus, and Moses. He hoped that he would be up for the challenge. It didn't take a saint or prophet to realize that spreading the news would be the first step in God's divine plan. Hence the advertisement. In preparation for the large audience, he had opened up the back of the sanctuary, normally a social hall, and filled it with folding chairs and old pews. He figured he'd be able to fit more than 1,500 people into the sanctuary in this manner. Looking around the room, he realized that it wasn't going to be enough. Pews designed for 4 people were often holding 7 or 8. People, as well as news reporters, had begun calling as soon as he had put the sign up. Many of them thought that he had been making the whole thing up in an attempt to get congregants who had defected to the Westboro Baptist Church. He had, of course, replied the truth. He wished he had made it all up. Unfortunately, he had seen the announcement himself. Everything was all too real. He often begged the callers to change their mind, but more often than not they hung up on him. Thanks to the grace of God, however, several people spoke to him with an open mind and were willing to listen. That was all he could do. His secretary informed him that the new sign had triggered a burst of new members of the congregation. God had performed his miracle and brought the candidates into the church. It was to Pitmos to finish the deal. The back of the room was full of television cameras and people working for the Associated Press. Several paparazzi had tried to interview him as he had come out to begin the service. He tried to shoo them away, explaining that they would find out at the same time as everyone else. Everyone was equal in the eyes of the Lord, and as a result, press reporters were not going to get any special treatment. It was a struggle to make it through the first half of the service, before the sermon. Everyone was talking excitedly, and he had been forced to call for silence at least a dozen times. God then granted him an observation which abruptly stopped the conversations. If the years of tribulation were upon us, we all had to be on our best behavior. After all, God was judging us, and he probably didn't like it when people ignored the words of the Bible and the hymns recommended by the preacher. Finally, he made it through the first half of the service. The notes of the organ faded away, and he ascended the podium to give his speech. He found it hard to see through all of the floodlights shining from the back of the room. He drew a deep breath. This had to be good. God, he prayed, please help me. I intend to do your will, and any help would be greatly appreciated. Feeling the grace of God falling upon his shoulders, he began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my duty to inform you of some terrible news. The moment we have been dreading for centuries has arrived. The last judgment is upon us. The Antichrist has come. The crowd murmured for a moment as camera flashes went off. He waited for the din to subside and continued. I had suspected for many months that the end times were upon us. People claiming to be wizards suddenly materializing out of nowhere. The Pope coming out with powers of the devil. Nuclear weapons proliferating throughout the world. Terror attacks. Climate change. Genocide. Stress. People aspiring to challenge God through technology, yet with no more wisdom than the people of Sodom. We have towers and skyscrapers, orders of magnitude larger than the accursed Tower of Babel. We nearly destroyed ourselves during the Cuban Missile Crisis 30 years ago, and ever since then, our weapons have gotten even more powerful. For the first time in history, mankind may very well have capability to bring revelation to fruition. Pitmos paused for emphasis. And now this, the arrival of the Antichrist. May God have mercy upon us all. He pushed a button on the podium, and a movie screen began lowering itself down from the ceiling. Several weeks ago, I brought up the possibility that magic was the mark of the beast, and that the so-called Secretary Radner could have been the false prophet. We all knew that the false prophet was the herald of the Antichrist, so I prayed for divine guidance and asked God what the Antichrist would likely look like. Praise the Lord, he answered me. I saw a vision of the Antichrist as a man with serpentine features, a wizard who came out of nowhere to try to grow a Muggle power base. A man who would likely seem to be a great leader until he showed his true colors and betrayed the people who had supported him. A man who would likely be deposed and possibly killed, only to be revived in a more powerful form. Just to show that I am not making this up, I will now replay my sermon from that week to prove that I indeed said this. Pitmos stuck a tape into a cassette player hidden in the podium and broadcast the appropriate part of the sermon from the previous week. The congregants nodded. It appeared that most of them had remembered the speech. Turning off the tape, he continued his sermon. With this in mind, watch the following broadcast that mysteriously appeared on British television last week. Every single channel all across the United Kingdom was magically sabotaged and forced to show the following public service announcement. Please do not speak until you have finished watching the footage. We'll have plenty of time to discuss it later. Pitmos pressed another button, and a British weatherman appeared on the screen, only to be replaced by static and a sign advertising Wizard Riddle and the Alliance for Magic. The pastor figured he wouldn't even have to watch to figure out when Riddle appeared on the screen. All he would have to do was listen to the reaction of the crowd. He wasn't disappointed. Virtually the entire congregation broke out into a spontaneous, terrible wail. 3 women fainted at least in the part of the congregation he could see clearly into, and several men began crying. A good 25% of the worshippers fell to their knees in desperate prayer, their hands clasped to crosses around their neck. Pitmos paused the recording, leaving Tom Riddle frozen on the screen. There he is, ladies and gentlemen, the Antichrist, just as God warned us. If there's a man who looks more like a serpent than he does, I haven't met him. This fellow looks more like a snake than a human. He comes out of nowhere, wields some magic, and tries to convince the world to listen to him. He likely has his eyes set on the Prime Minister's chair. Can you imagine what a man like this could do with one of the most powerful economies in the world at his beck and call? The pound sterling is one of the few currencies more powerful than the almighty dollar, for crying out loud. And Britain is part of the European Union, a federation of countries whose combined economic output rivals that of the United States. He didn't want to recite the next part of the speech, but he had to. He had to warn everyone. The Bible talks about Gog and Magog, the 2 giants fated to engage in an apocalyptic war. We had always thought that this battle would be between the United States and the Soviet Union. We thought we had gotten a reprieve when the Soviet Union collapsed. Little did we know that Magog would be reborn with Tom Riddle at the head of the European Union. A European Union which will be caught completely unaware, as it appears that the British government has not yet launched an investigation as to Wizard Riddle's true nature. He was barely able to finish his speech over all the screams and cries. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to me. It is extremely likely that all of us in this church have been saved. We will all be around to witness the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. However, we still have our work cut out for us, and we will have to do something to earn our salvation. With great power comes great responsibility. Our mission is obvious. It is up to us to spread the word of the Antichrist's arrival and save as many people as possible from the evil one and his minions. Time is running short, my friends. The next 7 years will be quite likely the most tumultuous period in all of required history. Brace yourselves and do not back down from the challenges we are about to face. Pitmos shook his head in resignation. That is all, my friends. May God walk with us and have mercy upon our souls, our friends' souls, and the souls of all upright human beings who walk this earth. Chapter 123. The Anti-Pope. April 21, 1996. George's Cathedral Vivacrane Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cup Celestine Roman 6 wait anxiously in the anteroom leading to the cathedral's main sanctuary. It was going to take a while for him to get accustomed to his new name, he thought. He'd been accustomed to using his given name for 56 years already, and it was often difficult to teach old dogs new tricks. He had never expected that he would be elected to the papacy. Granted, he was a very charismatic man. His flock admired him, and he had earned a well-deserved reputation for doing things because they were morally and ethically right, not necessarily because God commanded things. The time-worn question, what would Jesus do, meant a lot to him. The Vatican had taken notice of his devotion and dedication, and he had progressed quickly through the ranks. However, he refused to believe that he had the wisdom required to follow in the shoes of St. Peter. He just considered himself an ordinary man helping the community. He had to admit to himself that he wasn't even remotely on the same level as John Paul Roman II. He had assumed that John Paul would likely be canonized at the rate things were going, and he wasn't even dead yet. However, everything had changed when Samuel got involved. Like many Catholics, Celestine had been rather skeptical about Samuel's claims. All right, so the guy spoke ancient Hebrew. Big deal. There were probably a lot of ghosts running around from that time. For all Celestine knew, the man could be some Assyrian who happened to have had diplomatic ties with the Davidic kingdom and had been forced to learn the language. Unfortunately, as a Catholic, he had to follow the Pope's lead on this. The Pope had announced that he believed Samuel as the real thing and should be considered an extremely powerful voice in theological matters. This was doubly troubling to Celestine. Samuel had been born 1,000 years before the arrival of the Savior, and from what Celestine had heard, the man was completely out of touch with the fact that his old faith had splintered into 3 fractious sects, as the prophet called them. The new pope had to admit, however, that Samuel seemed to have the right ideas for the most part. He was in fact an extremely profound and brilliant spiritual thinker, but would his views be portable over 3,000 years? As if that wasn't bad enough, there were rumors that the ghost of Deborah the prophetess had shown up during Passover. Supposedly the woman was 49, dressed in a Muslim-style burqa, and had a vicious Napoleon complex. She seemed to be a 3-way cross between Margaret Thatcher, the Wizard of Oz, and Gloria Steinem. Oh, and she could transform herself into a bee. John Paul had not yet ruled on her authenticity, which was likely a wise decision. Preliminary investigations indicated that she was likely as authentic as Samuel, which didn't help much. However, acknowledging Deborah as a de facto priestess would probably open Pandora's box in the Catholic Church. He wondered which way John Paul would rule. Deborah and Samuel may have been great leaders in their time. However, their methods of implementing their policies would be absolutely worthless in a modern, industrialized society. Celestine knew that they couldn't be allowed to dictate how Christians all around the world were to live their lives, especially if their policies didn't match those of Christ. Although officially supporting the Pope's decision and openly recognizing Samuel as the real deal, he had spoken with several other clergymen who were convinced that letting Samuel run the show would just get the church into trouble. Some people suspected that Samuel had ensorcelled John Paul and was trying to make himself pope. He hadn't planned to make a schism in the Catholic Church. Having seen the friction which had developed over the years between the Catholics and Protestants, and not to mention the other 2 Abrahamic faiths, he had refused to even consider a motion which could lead to centuries of religious hatred. Unfortunately, Samuel's support of iconoclasm had been the final straw. A few weeks ago, he had received a message from John Paul Roman II indicating that Samuel wanted the icons removed. This had sent Celestine up in flames. The icons were an important part of services here in Eastern Europe. The worshippers knew that they weren't actually idols. Why should churches remove their icons on the off chance that someone thought they were idols? In Celestine's view, explaining the catechism to one person in the congregation per month was not worth the price of removing objects people had been venerating for hundreds of years. God had allowed the church to prosper over all these years with icons in their sanctuaries. Obviously, he approved of icons. If God approved of icons, what Samuel was trying to do was heresy. He understood where Samuel or whoever it was coming from. Icons probably would have been seen as idols to illiterate peasants thousands of years ago. But that was then. This is now. Samuel had no idea what he was doing, yet he had managed to convince John Paul Roman II, who was getting up there in age and may not be as sharp as he once was. Celestine had called a conference of archbishops and cardinals to discuss what should be done to deal with the iconoclasm controversy and with Samuel in general. They all agreed that John Paul had to take Samuel's words with a grain of salt. They had drafted a letter and sent it to the Pope. John Paul had written back saying that he understood their concern, but was convinced that Samuel had the Church's best interests in mind. This put the conference members in a dilemma. The Pope was infallible, but he was clearly wrong in this case. Celestine knew it deep down inside, as did many others. This led to one inescapable conclusion. God no longer approved of John Paul's position as Pope. Furthermore, Samuel was likely a fraud, as the real Samuel would be in tune with God's ideas. Granted, John Paul was a great asset to the Church and was in fact deserving of sainthood. On the other hand, the Parkinson's disease was becoming harder to disguise, and it was getting difficult for him to minister to the people. Was God hinting that John Paul should resign, spend his last years enjoying the fruits of his great work, and make way for someone new? Jesus had risked his life to do what was right and challenged the authorities of his time. He had been executed by the Romans, but had returned in triumph. With the Savior as an example, how could Celestine stay silent? The conference members had thought long and hard. Raising rival popes had always been a recipe for disaster. However, the committee had figured that they had no choice. They'd done an election similar to that of the papal conclave, and sure enough, Celestine had been elected on the first ballot. The fact that it had been unanimous on the first ballot was seen by many to be a sign from God. He had told the committee members straight out that he would immediately step down as soon as John Paul changed his mind and stopped listening to Samuel. Samuel would probably excommunicate him and the rest of his crew, and the Vatican would probably start calling him an antipope. He wasn't that worried about Samuel, as the man was probably a fake. However, he was horrified about the ramifications of the raising of an antipope. Would Catholicism split? Dealing with the new Catholics was bad enough. Would Celestine's follows be seen as anti-Bible and anti-wizard? Only time would tell. Drawing a deep breath and asking God for guidance, Celestine Roman VI headed into the cathedral to face a gauntlet of paparazzi, at least as frightening as phalanx of Romans. Chapter 124, Human Portkey. April 24, 1996, the Borough England Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cup. Harry Potter couldn't believe that he'd managed to make it out of Malfoy Manor in one piece. He remembered returning to Voldemort's headquarters, armed with Quirrell's information on the Horcruxes. He played dead as long as he could, waiting for Voldemort and his henchmen to leave the room to pursue their diabolical endeavors. His joints had started to ache, and his muscles were screaming at him to change his position. Fortunately, at about that time, Voldemort seemed to remember that there was a dead body in the room. He asked Lucius to remove Harry. Lucius had conjured up a stretcher and carried the motionless Harry outside. The Death Eater then did something which Harry had never even considered. He turned Harry into a Portkey and sent him back to the burrow, precisely in the location he'd left. Harry didn't really appreciate life as a Portkey. His body trembled with magical energies which needed to be released. The powers all let go at once as Harry felt the familiar hook behind the navel yanking him back to the burrow. The next thing he knew, Harry was back in his room in the burrow as if nothing had happened. Lucius's action hadn't made sense at first. Why didn't he just destroy what the Death Eaters assumed was a dead body? However, Harry thought about it more and realized why Lucius had done what he did. Harry wasn't supposed to have left the burrow. A dead Harry in the burrow could be attributed to a heart attack, an assassination combined with a sleeping guard, or a disease. A dead Harry in Malfoy Manor would have left Lucius with a lot of awkward questions to answer. Harry tried to tell the guards about the Horcruxes. However, they didn't believe him. They believed Voldemort was dead, for one thing, and attributed Harry's wild tale to a bad dream. Harry wished that he had the pieces of the broom that had served his means of transportation to Malfoy Manor that would have served as hard evidence. Lucius, of course, had sent him back empty-handed. So here he was again, back in the burrow, with information which could be used to finish off Voldemort once and for all. In the old days, he'd have talked to Sirius through the Flu network. However, the guards had disconnected the burrow from the Flu network to prevent Harry from escaping. How long was he going to sit here? Probably a while, he thought. The return of Voldemort would probably occupy most of the Ministry's time. They wouldn't really get a chance to reconsider imprisoning Harry for a crime which hadn't really been his fault. Would he get out in time to take his owls? Would he even be let back into Hogwarts? No one knew. His only companions were Marley Weasley and that monster in the attic, and he was getting a bit sick of Marley's gift for helicopter parenting. He was just feeding Hedwig when he heard a commotion outside. The guards seemed to be excited about something. Curious, he looked out the window. The guards were all talking to a man he'd never seen before. Harry watched in amazement as one of the guards saluted and opened the door. The newcomer walked in with a piece of parchment in his hand. Harry heard the man call out, "Harry Potter, Harry, I am Minister of Magic Rufus Scrimgeour. I've got news for you, young man. You've been pardoned. You are no longer under house arrest. I've got your wand, and you can return to Hogwarts." Harry's jaw dropped. Rufus Scrimgeour. Who the hell was Rufus Scrimgeour? He knew who the Minister of Magic was, and his first name wasn't Rufus. Had the minister been deposed? Was this man a servant of Voldemort? He needed to play this carefully. He called downstairs. "I'm here, Minister. I'd come down to greet you, but in all fairness, I don't know who you are. Did something happen to Cornelius Fudge? Considering what's just happened to me, I'd prefer to be a bit cautious when it comes to meeting new people." The voice responded, "That's understandable, Harry. Rest assured that Fudge is no longer in the picture. He's just been made a special ambassador to Togo. I'm his replacement." Harry frowned. "Togo? Who's Togo?" "Togo's not a who, Harry. It's a small country in Western Africa." "What's he doing there?" The voice interrupted. "A lot of things have happened over the past few days, Harry. I've got a copy of the Daily Prophet which will explain everything. Headmistress McGonagall should be arriving shortly as well." Harry gasped. "Headmistress McGonagall? What the bloody?" Scrimgeour shouted back up at him. "I've left the paper on the stairs, Harry. I'll leave the house momentarily so you can come down and read it if you're nervous about having me around. That will explain everything." Harry heard something being thrown on the stairs. A few seconds later, he heard the front door open and the man leave. A couple of minutes after that, he heard Marley Weasley scream. "Harry, get down here. You've got to see this. Oh my God." That clinched it. He raced down the stairs and watched Marley shaking in her shoes. Wordlessly, she handed over the parchment Scrimgeour had left on the stairs. Harry only had to read 2 words to realize that this was going to be big. Voldemort returns. Tom Riddle addresses nation on Muggle television. Asking for support. Evil wizard creates political party to recruit unsuspecting Muggles ministry officials. Suspect Dark Lord has eye on 10 Downing Street. Cornelius Fudge sacked. Minerva McGonagall made head of Hogwarts. Ministry of Magic, he's back. Lord Voldemort, long believed to be dead, has managed to return to Britain. This time, he has his eyes on the Muggles as well as the wizards. He was first thought dead in 1981 after his failed attack on the Potters. However, he reappeared in June, where he killed Triwizard Tournament contestant Cedric Diggory. A combined Muggle-Wizard raid seemed to have finished him off for good once more back in March, yet the man somehow still managed to come back. This time, the Ministry vows that it will not rest until the Dark Lord is dead for good. The Dark Lord introduced himself to the Muggle world on 16 April by interrupting television service all over Britain and forcing Muggles to watch him announce the formation of a new political party, the Alliance for Magic. Voldemort claims that he will be running on a platform based on peaceful coexistence between the wizards and the Muggles. Judging from Muggle polls which have been taken over the past week, he is starting to get some support in the Muggle community. A good 38% of the British population is intrigued by AFM, and 4% have already changed their affiliation to the new party. Both numbers will likely rise as time passes. The Dark Lord portrayed himself as a friend of Muggles, wearing a George cross, which he undoubtedly borrowed from a Death Eater who had been involved with the Canary Wharf rescue. The Muggles have no idea that this man is arguably the most dangerous wizard ever to live, and that he almost certainly plans to turn on the Muggles once he has been appointed Prime Minister. The announcement caught both the Ministry of Magic and the British government completely by surprise. Both the Muggle and wizarding authorities had known about the existence of the Dark Lord. However, both of them had classified Voldemort as top secret. Since you know who introduced himself as Tom Riddle and not Voldemort, the Muggles could not link the new candidate to the evil wizard who did not officially exist. Cornelius Fudge found himself in a bind as well, having spent all these months saying that Voldemort hadn't returned to begin with. He couldn't just admit that he had been withholding information from the community. Needless to say, there was an uproar in the ministry as soon as wizarding officials found out about the broadcast. Cornelius Fudge was sacked almost immediately and sent off to be a liaison to the remote West African nation of Togo. His associate, the former Aura Rufus Scrimgeour, has replaced him as Minister of Magic. Unlike Fudge, Scrimgeour will not hold anything back from the wizarding community of Britain. If there is something Britons need to know, he will tell them. There have been changes at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry as well. Realizing that defense against the dark arts has just become far from theoretical, Scrimgeour has recalled defense against the dark arts Professor Dolores Umbridge and replaced her with a wizard more than familiar with Voldemort's tactics, Severus Snape. Potions will now be taught by Professor Horace Slughorn, who has come out of retirement to fill Snape's old position. Minerva McGonagall has replaced Umbridge as head of the school. The position of Gryffindor housemaster has been filled by Albus Dumbledore, who has been demoted from his prior position because of the incident with Sirius Black and the Time Turner. Although Dumbledore's suspicion was eventually proven to be correct, the fact that he encouraged an underage student to use the Time Turner for unauthorized purposes should not be overlooked. Realizing that Azkaban was likely too extreme a punishment for such an offense, Scrimgeour managed to contact Dumbledore, something which he found almost impossible to do, and reduced the sentence to a demotion. In other news, Harry Potter has been freed from Fudge's sentence of house arrest. In all fairness, though, this was overdue. He may only be 15, but he has done great things for the wizarding community, such as destroying the basilisk in the Chamber of Secrets and making sure that Voldemort didn't get the Philosopher's Stone. He will once again be able to attend Hogwarts. Hermione Granger, the brilliant Gryffindor who used the Time Turner, has also been readmitted. She had just been following Dumbledore's orders after all. The Ministry would like to emphasize that Harry is not responsible for the Super Bowl breach, regardless of what Fudge said. In truth, no wizard could have known that the disillusionment charm would fail to work against video recorders, for the simple reason that it had never been tested on Muggle equipment. More information will come in as it becomes available. In the meantime, please take all precautions necessary to keep the Death Eaters from spying on you or impersonating you through the polyjuice potion. Harry put down the paper in shock. Everything had happened so fast. It took him a few seconds for him to realize that two new people were now standing in front of him. One of them was the man he had seen talking to the guards, Rufus Scrimgeour. The other was one of the people he admired most. Minerva McGonagall smiled at him. "Welcome back to Hogwarts, Harry Potter. If there is anything we can do to make up for your lost time, short of using another time-turner, tell us, and we will make it happen." Harry brought himself back to the present in a hurry. "As a matter of fact, there is, Professor McGonagall." McGonagall smiled. "Headmistress now. However, it's still a bit of a surprise to me as well." Harry chuckled. "Sorry, Headmistress. I have an urgent message from the late Professor Quirrell. Yes, he's dead. However, I was comatose momentarily after Voldemort attacked me in Malfoy Manor on the 15th. I spoke with him and my father in a place which they called Limbo." All three adults stared at him. Finally, McGonagall burst out. "What? How? What did he say?" Harry rushed ahead. "I don't know how it happened, Headmistress. However, Professor Quirrell told me something that he picked up from Voldemort's mind after the Dark Lord possessed him. The information should have died with him, but he was able to pass it on while I was indisposed." McGonagall's eyes widened. "Really? What is this?" Harry was blunt. "Voldemort has Horcruxes, 5 of them. Quirrell knew what they are and told me. Destroy them, and you will be able to kill him once and for all." There was dead silence for a good 30 seconds, after which McGonagall almost pounced on him. Chapter 125, Pegasus Test Flight. April 25, 1996. Bentley Motor Corporation Crew. England. Horcruxes left. 5. Tierra, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Arthur Weasley had promised Cornelius Fudge that he wouldn't do any more work to get Fords to fly. Bentleys, on the other hand, were an entirely different story. Parked before him was the prototype model of the 1997 Bentley Pegasus. They had taken a 1996 Brooklands, made some cosmetic changes, adapted it for flight, and surrounded it with decorations based on the Muggle cartoon The Jetsons. Arthur had learned that this cartoon took place in a somewhat utopian future, where flying cars were an everyday occurrence. The prototype chosen for this demonstration lacked many of the features the fully developed car would have. The ejection seats weren't in it, for one thing. Although Arthur was convinced that the magic wouldn't allow the vehicle to crash, the Muggles were adamant that the car include the ejection seats. Otherwise, Bentley would be hit with reams of lawsuits. Adapting the Brooklands chassis for flight had been a relatively simple operation. Someone had managed to purchase a large supply of argon-38. The electronics-saving gas was coming increasingly popular and expensive, and filled the car with it. This allowed Arthur to enchant it without blowing out any of the Muggle electronics. The steering wheel had been modified so that it could be tilted towards or away from the driver, much like the controls of an airplane. Tilting it forward would cause the car to go downward, and tilting backwards would cause it to head skyward. The steering wheel would remain locked in its normal position, and would only be able to change the car's altitude when a special button was pressed at the same time the steering column was pushed or pulled. The car was capable of flight, but everyone acknowledged that it would be used primarily as a street vehicle. The engineers had changed the hood ornament as well. Instead of a simple bee, the vehicle sported an ornament which showed a bee on a flying horse. Arthur thought that was a nice touch. The only problem was that he'd seen Pegasi before, and they didn't look at all like the animal shown on the ornament. The president promised that they'd change it before the car went into production. The car had been painted a brilliant white. The president had fitted the test vehicle with virtually every single optional feature: a sunroof, chrome hubcaps, and so forth. Supposedly, the vehicle as shown here would be selling for over £650,000. It would be the perfect advertisement. Advertising was the goal here, after all. The entire purpose for this press conference had been to introduce the vehicle, demonstrate its flight capabilities, and if possible get some customers to place some orders. Arthur still wasn't certain that people would spend £500,000 on a car, but the president seemed to know what he was talking about. Arthur wasn't the only wizard in the room. In a move that reeked of absolute genius, his son Bill had brought his quarter-vila girlfriend, Triwizard contestant Fleur de la Sour, over to the office to show off the vehicle. The combination of a fancy car and a pretty girl would be an overpowering 1-2 punch. Arthur had never been particularly fond of the girl, but even he had to admit that her vila nature would come in handy here. The agenda was as follows. The president would make a speech describing the features of the new car. He would then jump into the car with the CEO and hand the keys to one of the engineers. The engineer would drive the car around the block a few times, demonstrating what the car could do. Finally, at the end of the presentation, the engineer would relinquish controls to Arthur, who would get the Pegasus off the ground. Arthur looked around the showroom. The room was packed with people in black suits, which Arthur had learned represented Muggle formal wear. All of them were ogling the car and taking photograph. His eyebrows shot up when he realized that they weren't ogling the car. They were ogling Fleur. Mildly disturbed, he walked over to the president and reported his observation. The president grinned. "Don't worry about it, Arthur. She's in the car, and any picture of her is going to get the car as well. As long as they publicize the car, that's fine with me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to get this show on the road. You're sure the magic is ready for use?" Arthur nodded. "It is, sir. I've done some field tests in that enclosed hangar and it flies like a bird. We shouldn't have any problems." Relieved, the president slapped Arthur on the back and headed up to the podium to make his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the headquarters of Bentley Motor Corporation. We have come today to announce a new model of vehicle, the 1997 Bentley Pegasus. It's got specs similar to a Brooklands and rides like a Brooklands. Its base price will be £499,995. The guests, who had not been told that the vehicle was capable of flight, looked at each other in surprise. The president, however, had been expecting this. "Yes, I'm aware it's a little pricier than a typical Brooklands. However, this isn't just an ordinary car. What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is the first mass-produced flying vehicle." There was a gasp of astonishment from the crowd, and Muggles started taking pictures of the new car in droves. The president continued. "Yes, it flies, and it doesn't even need wings to do it. Thanks to the services of a wizard, the car flies on the wings of magic. Yes, you heard me right. Magic." The president tried to continue, but was drowned out by people asking questions. He had to wait a few minutes for the tumult to subside. When it did, he turned to Arthur. "Allow me to introduce our chief, Wizard Arthur Weasley. He served in the Ministry of Magic for several years and had been experimenting with flying vehicles even before the Super Bowl. Arthur, the floor is yours." Cameras flashed wildly as he approached the microphone. He had to forcibly restrain himself from investigating the curious device that Muggles use to enhance communication. Drawing a deep breath, he explained. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Wizard Arthur Weasley, and I was involved with the magical enhancements that made the Pegasus possible. The magic will allow the driver to ascend to at most 500 meters at a maximum ascent angle of 6 degrees. Once at 500 meters, the car will automatically level off. This has been done to prevent people from flying too high and suffering from cold or lack of oxygen. Landing the vehicle will be safe and easy. The car will automatically level off when it approaches the ground or another obstacle. Its maximum descent angle, like its ascent angle, will be 6 degrees. The magic should last for 3 years at a time, after which the vehicle should be brought back to an appropriate Bentley agent so the magic can be recharged. That was actually not the case. The magic would work indefinitely, as far as Arthur knew. However, the company was convinced that they could milk their customers for more money by forcing them to come in for unnecessary maintenance. Auto repair shops were notorious for that, from what Arthur had been told. It is extremely unlikely that you will encounter problems during flight. You could have turbulence, much as you may experience while you are flying in an airplane. If, against all odds, there is a problem while the vehicle is airborne and the car starts falling back to the ground, ejection seats will automatically ignite, catapulting the occupants to safety. A passenger's ejection seat will be armed as soon as he or she buckles the seat belt. The 1997 model will be using magic only to make the vehicle fly. There are plans on the table to use magic to improve the gas mileage, maximum velocity, and other important metrics. These new features will be considered for the 1998 model. As far as the spells I used to enchant the vehicle go, I'm afraid I can't give any details as they're proprietary. What I can tell you, however, is that the electronics inside the vehicle did not suffer from the spell casting. This was because we filled the vehicle with argon-38, a gas which prevents magic from affecting electronics, before I cast the spell. The car lacks wings, as you can see. This allows it to take to the air at a moment's notice, without even having to reconfigure the vehicle for flight. That has always been one of the main drawbacks to flying cars, and as you can see, we have overcome that. With that, he turned the floor back over to the president, who finished the presentation. After a brief question and answer period, the president moved everyone outside to begin the demonstration. A few people took pictures of the car navigating hairpin turns, stopping on a dime, driving through puddles, and so forth. However, it was obvious that everyone was waiting for the final exhibit, the flight. At long last, the time had come. The engineer, actually a trained stunt driver who had performed the road test, got out of the car and handed the keys to Arthur. Arthur was nearly blinded by camera flashes as the keys fell into his hand. Sliding into the driver's seat, he drove the car out into the office's parking lot. Checking to make sure that there weren't any birds or buildings too close to him, he pulled back on the steering wheel and rose into the air. The crowd shrank beneath him as he rose to about 50 meters and made a few laps around the area. His passengers whooped with delight and took pictures out the windows. Down beneath him, a horde of video cameras focused skyward, tracking the vehicle's every movement. He had completed 3 out of his planned 10 circuits, driving at a leisurely 30 mph when he saw a helicopter approaching him. It was a traffic report helicopter. As it passed, he saw one of the passengers staring at him with her mouth open. Arthur had just finished waving to her when he heard a thud far below. Looking down, he saw that 3 cars which had been driving in his direction had bumped fenders on one of the major highways. Presumably, they'd seen the Pegasus and been distracted. A few streets away from the accident scene, people were climbing out of their cars just to look up. Behind him, the Bentley bigwigs shook their hands and congratulated each other. This appeared to have been a very successful demonstration. Chapter 126. Zeno denounces Voldemort. April 28, 1996. Catchpol's Roman Catholic churchardary, St. Catchpol, England, Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cup. Xenophilius Lovegood was very curious as to what exactly would happen during church today. A lot of stuff had happened over the past week, including some developments which delivered British Catholics a double blow. The Catholic Church had always believed that the Pope was the final authority on religious matters. This made perfect sense in that hierarchical organizations often didn't work well when they were governed by committee. On the other hand, no one had ever thought they'd have to deal with a disagreement over who the Pope was. What had originally started as a dispute over Samuel's authenticity had rapidly snowballed into a referendum on iconoclasm and on wizards in general. The situation was eerily similar to the sequence of events which led to the Reformation. The Celestines, as the splinter group was called, argued that wizards should stay out of the church, and that Samuel, or whoever it was, should keep his mouth shut about things he didn't understand. Most of the Celestine churches were in Eastern Europe, in areas where there had always been a traditional focus on icons. At the rate things were going, a large portion of the Byzantine Catholic Church would likely go Celestine within a few months. The cardinal, who had eventually become Celestine Roman VI, had insisted that he had no intention of splitting off from Rome. He had only raised himself to the papacy because he thought the supposedly infallible John Paul was making a mistake. Unfortunately, both popes were finding that things were getting out of control. Scholars had been arguing over the church's views on magic ever since the wizards had first come out. The fact that the new pope had disapproved of Samuel and John Paul, both wizards, had almost immediately earned Celestine the support of conservative Catholics who hadn't liked the wizards to begin with. As if that weren't bad enough, several of them were spouting America for Humans theories that John Paul was the false prophet and Tom Riddle was the Antichrist. There were rumors that the Celestines had brought back the Latin Mass and were starting to preach against evolution in favor of intelligent design. What a mess. Samuel must be having apoplexy, Zeno thought. Here he comes to try to unify the Abrahamic faiths, and all he manages to do is help create another schism. God works in mysterious ways, he supposed. Seeing John Paul as the false prophet was a terrible defamation of the man's name. Regardless of whether one believed in wizards, one could not deny that John Paul had done great things for the church. The church had prospered under his tutelage and had managed to do so even though he had been a wizard the whole time. Wizard Riddle's role as the Antichrist made no sense from a Muggle perspective. Yes, the man looked strange, had appeared out of nowhere, and was trying to consolidate power in Britain. Unfortunately, the Muggles had no idea that he was actually Lord Voldemort. As far as they knew, he was just another British politician, possibly an MP, who decided that he'd be able to help the country by using magic. The fact that he had managed to procure a George Cross also appeared to count in his favor. Zeno knew the truth, however. He was all too familiar with Lord Voldemort, having lived through Voldemort's bid for power back in the late 70s and early 80s. He was firmly convinced that Voldemort would betray the British population, and possibly the world, if he ever actually were elected Prime Minister. Zeno had to put a stop this post-haste. He had spoken to the priest about Riddle's alter ego, and the priest had agreed to let Zeno speak to the congregation. Zeno was worried, however, that a sermon about the election of the antipope would probably trump anything that the priest had planned for Zeno. The church wasn't just crowded, it was overcrowded. The priest had actually been forced to add a second mass later on in the morning and had started shooing people out once they reached the limit imposed by the fire code. The icons were still gone, so it looked like this particular congregation hadn't gone Celestine. At least for the time being, Zeno amended. The congregation hushed almost immediately when the priest stood up to deliver the sermon. Ladies and gentlemen, several momentous events have transpired this week. First and foremost, we have seen the election of a rival claimant to the papacy. His regnal name is Celestine Roman VI, and he hails from a Byzantine Catholic church in the Ukraine. From what I've been told, he had believed that John Paul had lost his right to the papacy by supporting Samuel, whom Celestine believed was not the man he claimed he was. He also argued that the prophet's decree against icons would be detrimental to worship in communities, which relied on icons for spiritual inspiration. I met Celestine when he was still an archbishop. He is a good man. I believe he is sincere when he says that he does not intend to create a schism. I suspect that he would in fact step down if John Paul resigned or stopped listening to Samuel. Unfortunately, the schism has evolved into a referendum on iconoclasm, much as like which happened with the Greek Orthodox Church back in the old days, and the religious status of wizards. The fact that Samuel and John Paul are both wizards basically gave the factions, which disapproved of wizards a casus belli, so to speak. The priest looked over the crowd. As you probably suspected from the lack of icons, this congregation is going to stay Roman Catholic. However, if a Celestine Catholic wishes to worship here, I urge everyone in this room to make him feel welcome. If there's going to be a split in the Catholic Church, it's not going to be under my watch. Although we're going to stick to John Paul's rights here, we're not going to treat the splinter movement as second-class citizens. Jesus would have welcomed everyone to his services, and we will do the same here. The crowd applauded heartily, Zeno among them. The priest waited for it to subside and continued. I'd also like to bring up one of the other major developments this week, namely Wizard Riddle's announcement on television. Unfortunately, I'm not a wizard, so I'm not really a good person to comment on it. However, Zeno here is familiar with this man and is willing to speak to you. He has something which I think you should take to heart. With no further ado, Xenophilius Lovegood. The priest backed off as Zeno walked to the podium. It looked like Zeno would be able to give his speech after all. Ladies and gentlemen, Holy Father, thank you for letting me speak. Yes, I do know Tom Riddle. He is a very well-known and powerful wizard. Unfortunately, he is not the trustworthy man he appears in the commercial. In the wizarding world, he is known as Lord Voldemort and is about as evil as wizards go. There have been multiple attempts on his life, and in all of these cases he was left for dead. However, he has always managed to come back. Some wizards are wondering if he can even be killed. You should not associate with this man or get involved with the Alliance for Magic. Riddle is well known for his beliefs that wizards are superior to Muggles and envisions a world where the Muggles are virtually enslaved by the wizards. He is likely trying to capitalize on the fact that the Muggle world is unfamiliar with him by presenting you with a fake persona, one which will allow him to get into power. Once he is in power, he will betray the lot of you and force you into servitude at roughly the level of the Israelites in Egypt. I know what you're thinking. Riddle said that he was misunderstood and that the authorities would try to shoot him down. That is not the case. I am an ordinary civilian wizard like you. I am not part of the Ministry of Magic. However, I was around during the last time he tried to take over, back in the late 70s and early 80s. People were killed left and right, and the entire populace was quivering with fear. You Muggles were only spared because the statute of secrecy was still in force at the time. Now that the statute is gone, Riddle finds himself in the perfect position to expand his power base. You may wonder how a wizard like him managed to earn the George Cross. The answer is, he likely didn't. You have to remember that virtually everyone in the ministry participated in the Canary Wharf rescue and got GCs. Riddle either has a clandestine supporter in the Ministry of Magic or killed someone in the ministry and took his medal. Yes, Riddle has no qualms about killing people, especially Muggles. My friends, I urge you to spread this news as quickly as you can. If you want more information, see if you can get an audience with Albus Dumbledore, Severus Snape, and Minerva McGonagall, the senior instructors at the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. They will be more than able to provide evidence to support these claims. Rufus Scrimgeour, the new Minister of Magic, will also be a good person to talk to. Zeno raised his hands in resignation. I apologize for being the bearer of bad news. However, I must say things as they are. May God have mercy upon us all. The congregation responded in unison. Amen. Chapter 127. Industrial Espionage. April 29, 1996, Harold Green Pharmaceutical Corporation, Charleston, South Carolina, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cup. The door to Mr. Green's office slammed open unexpectedly. The president of Harold Green looked up from his desk to see Wizard Hendrickson staring him in the face. Green stared up in surprise. David, what? The wizard didn't keep him waiting. Flamel lied to us. Flamel, who? Dr. Nicholas Flamel, sir, the British professor who claimed to have created the Philosopher's Stone. Green recalled the incident now. Ah, I remember now. We asked him about the stone, and he told us he never got it to work. He showed us his manuscript, and you reported that it claimed that he had experimented with making a stone, and it didn't work. The wizard smiled through clenched teeth and tossed something onto Green's desk. I was aware of that, sir. I did the translation. I believed it myself for a long time. However, that was before I stumbled across this. Green reached down and picked up the object. It appeared to be a dynamic photograph of an old man with a long beard. The man was winking at him. Green knew enough about magical devices to know that anything with a dynamic photograph on it had to have had a magical origin. He looked from the card back to Hendrickson. What is this? Hendrickson rolled his eyes for a moment, then stopped in embarrassment when he realized that Muggles like Green didn't know what the object was. It's a chocolate frog card, sir. They come in packages of British wizarding chocolates. The cards feature profiles of famous witches and wizards. Green frowned. What do I do with this? You can start by answering the following question. Would you say that this man seems to be in pretty decent health? Green looked back at the card. I'd say so, yes. How old would you say he is? Green shrugged. Mid-60s, why? You'll see. Now turn the card over and read the back. Green did so and began reading. Albus Dumbledore, currently Transfiguration Professor at Hogwarts and head of Gryffindor House. Born August 5, 1881, in Mold-on-the-Wold. Considered by many to be the greatest wizard of modern times, Dumbledore is particularly famous for his defeat of. He froze. Something didn't make sense here. He looked over the last two sentences again. Sure enough, he had read it right. This man was born in 1881 and still alive. Slowly, he lowered the card to the table and pointed an accusing finger at it. Are you telling me that this man is 114? Wizard Hendrickson smiled in triumph. Exactly. Does that seem a bit odd to you? Green looked at the card again. I should say so, my friend, but don't wizards tend to live longer than Muggles? The wizard nodded. Yes. However, 114 is really pushing it, even for a wizard. And to be 114 and look like you're 63. Could it be that this is an old card? Perhaps it's 25-30 years old, and the wizard has since died. Hendrickson shook his head vigorously. Nope. It claims Dumbledore is Transfiguration teacher and not the head of Hogwarts. That happened during the past month. It's up to date. Green read the first half of the back of the card again. This man is supposedly the greatest wizard of modern times, David. Perhaps he takes good care of himself. Perhaps he has a spell which retards aging. Wizard chuckled, or stops it. Suddenly, Green realized what you're saying. Slowly, he asked, are you telling me that Flamel created the stone after all, and is using it to retard this man's aging in addition to his own? It sure looks like it, so does it not? Green thought for a moment. It's possible. However, there's a bit of a hole in your argument. Does Flamel even know this man? The wizard's response was short and succinct. Read on. Green picked up the card and continued reading the back. Dumbledore is particularly famous for his defeat of the dark wizard Grindelwald in 1945, for the discovery of the 12 uses of dragon's blood, and his work on alchemy with his partner. Both Green and the wizard finished the sentence simultaneously. Nicholas Flamel. Green swore viciously. Son of a bitch, he lied to us. He had the damn stone the whole time. The wizard reached into his pocket and brought out some old photographs. It sure looks like it, sir. And if that's not enough proof, take a look at these. Green looked at the photographs. They appeared to be taken on a college campus. One seemed to be from 1960. The others seemed to be from 1934 and in amazingly good condition from 1901. Puzzled, he looked up at the wizard. These photographs are of the staff of the English department at Flamel's University. Take a look at the 1963 shot. Do you see Flamel there? He looked at the photograph and picked out Flamel immediately. There he is. He looks exactly the same. He hasn't changed over 30 years. Hendrickson chuckled. Oh, he hasn't. However, take a look at his name in the key at the bottom of the photograph. He did so and whistled. John Flamel. The wizard leaned over the desk. He's changing his name to hide the fact that he's immortal. He probably takes a few years off as a sabbatical, calls it a retirement, waits for all the students who knew him to graduate, and then has his son take over. Stunned, Green reached for the other two photographs. Flamel appeared in both of them, looking exactly the same. The 1901 photograph had him as Nicholas Flamel. The one from 1930s had him as Robert Flamel. The wizard whispered. He probably cycles through those three names every few generations to keep people off his tail. Remember that medieval Britons often reused names. Green gasped. You think he goes that far back? I wouldn't be surprised. Alchemy is a very old discipline. I'll find out, though. Trust me. Green thought for a moment. This changes things a lot. We need to get our hands on that stone. Indeed we do, sir. The question is how. Green looked up at him and tried to wink like Dumbledore. I think it's time for some industrial espionage. Chapter 128, The Tiara. April 30, 1996, Room of Requirement, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Great Britain. Next path. 129, Draco Malfoy. Horcruxes left. 5, Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Severus Snape followed Fred Weasley through the hallways. He figured that some prankster over the years would create a room like this. The motivation was obvious. Student creates something illegal, like a love potion. Teacher finds out and rushes to investigate. Student needs a place to hide the potion in a hurry. Voila, a room of requirement. Harry Potter also had no idea that the room of requirement existed. This surprised Snape greatly, as the boy was notorious for getting into trouble. However, he had insisted that the room existed. It had taken a while for the authorities to find someone insubordinate enough to actually know about it and be willing to talk about it. Potter had claimed that the Ravenclaw tiara was in the room of requirement and that it was a Horcrux. The staff was divided over whether to believe Harry's bizarre conversation with the dead Professor Quirrell. Fortunately, there would be an easy way to verify his claim. Head into the room of requirement, find the tiara, check for the Horcrux, and destroy it. Snape wasn't alone. Harry Potter was coming along for the ride, much to Snape's chagrin. Headmistress McGonagall, Dumbledore, Flitwick, and Karkaroff were there, as well as Sirius Black and Alistair Moody. The former Azkaban inmate was carrying the great sword of Gryffindor, a weapon which had been anointed with basilisk venom 3 years ago. If Dumbledore's suspicions were correct, and Snape believed they were, the weapon would be able to destroy a Horcrux. The abrupt departure of the teachers from their classrooms had triggered a burst of free periods and happy reactions from the students. Snape figured that they didn't really need to know what had been so urgent, for the teachers had suddenly leave their lectures halfway through. McGonagall had nearly flipped when Snape explained that Karkaroff had been hanging around in their kitchen. She accepted Karkaroff's request for asylum and listened as the former Death Eater found Harry's story plausible. Fred's rush through the corridors stopped abruptly in front of a blank wall. Snape watched as the mischievous young man paced in front of the wall a few times, muttering words to himself. The entire Hogwarts staff then gasped in unison as a doorway materialized out of nowhere. Weasley turned to the instructors and explained, "All right, here's the story. I must be the first to enter the room, as the room has configured itself to show the hidden objects per my request. You can follow me in. Once you're in, the room will around as long as at least one person is in it." Fred started marching towards the entrance, then suddenly hesitated and turned back to the professors. "Once you're in there, be careful. There are piles of junk everywhere. If you knock something down, you may block the exit." McGonagall nodded. Snape, however, looked at him strangely. "I trust that we will not find any of your things in there, Mr. Weasley." Fred froze. Snape could see the gears turning in his head. Finally, the redhead admitted it. "Probably. I suppose you can confiscate them if you want." Snape smiled in triumph, just as Fred replied, "My brother and I can always recreate them." The teachers muttered among themselves as Fred headed through the opening into the room of requirement. Snape, wand at the ready, followed Fred into the room. Weasley hadn't been lying when he said the room was crowded. Piles reached halfway up to the ceiling in some places. The entire place seemed to be a maze. Passages ended in dead ends here, T-junctions there. Snape looked at the pile next to him. He saw at least 3 spellbooks, a remembrall, a picture of several topless Hollifield Harpies team members taken in 1966, and several papers. McGonagall whistled. "We're going to have to catalogue all this stuff. Mr. Weasley, how much of this stuff have you examined?" Fred shook his head. "Not much, headmistress. We only know our stuff. I suspect we've got centuries of clutter in here." Snape cut in. "May I recommend that we catalogue this later and focus on what we came for? I recommend that we split up and search the room. There's too much stuff here for one person to go through. If anyone sees anything remotely resembling a tiara, call for Phileas." "Phileas, I take it you know what the tiara looks like." Flitwick nodded. "Yes, Severus. There's a statue of Rowena Ravenclaw with a copy of the tiara on her head. I'd recognize it if I saw it." "Good. Keep your wands at the ready. If you have to use them, make sure you don't knock things over. For all we know, there could be things that could explode if some dunderhead bumps into it. Potter, Weasley, stay outside and keep an eye on the entrance. Feel free to hex anyone who tries to come in after us." Both boys naturally complained. It was obvious that they wanted in on the action. Well, they weren't going to get it. A few threats of detention later, the 2 miscreants gave in and left the room. Snape breathed a sigh of relief. He hadn't wanted Weasley interfering with the search by trying to hide his own stuff. The team spread out and began searching the room. Snape investigated a cabinet, which looked to have been a vanishing cabinet at one point, but now looked to be partially broken. There was a plate with an expression around its edge, which even Dumbledore didn't recognize. "Ephilateg art, inu, astroc capsi durat near teruofi." Beneath the plate was a large selection of joke-related objects, which appeared to be just the type of stuff Fred and George would be working on. He'd seen them try to deploy these devices against Umbridge earlier in the year. He made a mental note to remember the object's location. Considering that Weasley's knowledge of the room made it possible for the teachers to have a shot at this Horcrux, the kid deserved a bit of a break. However, the next time he acted up, Snape was going to nail him. There was a shout from the other side of the room. It was Karkaroff. "Professor Flitwick, I think I've got it." It took a while for all of the searchers to make it through the maze over to Karkaroff. The man had stopped in front of a statue of an old witch. On the statue's head was an old, discolored tiara. Karkaroff moved out of the way so Flitwick could have a look. The charm's master nodded abruptly. "That's it, Karkaroff, that's it. I wonder how long it's been here." Snape growled. "You can wonder on your own time, Phileas. Everyone who is not an aura, get behind me. Black, get over here with that sword. Cast Protego shields upon yourselves. We have no idea what this is going to do." Once the teachers were out of the way, Snape cast a complex spell which would react to the presence of human souls. All of the searchers' souls glowed brightly. The color of each soul's aura depended on which house its owner was from. Gold for Gryffindor, green for Slytherin, blue for Ravenclaw, and red for Hufflepuff. One other object glowed as well, the tiara. However, its glow was not the blue for Ravenclaw. It was green and slightly fainter than the others. It was good thing that Potter and Weasley had been sent outside. Otherwise, they would have probably nearly died laughing at the long string of expletives uttered by their instructors. Snape didn't know how Harry had managed to contact Quirrell. However, it was obvious that at least part of Harry's outrageous claim was indeed correct. There was something alive in there, and it was not the soul of a Ravenclaw. Snape considered what to do. The Horcrux needed to be destroyed, naturally. The sword would do that, all right. However, he had suspected that Voldemort had chosen this object for a reason. It was a hallowed Hogwarts relic. The head of Ravenclaw wouldn't want it destroyed. Snape cast a glance at Flitwick and saw the conflict in the man's face. Snape thought for a moment and then came up with an idea. Raising his wand, he pointed it at the tiara and shouted, "Geminio," twice. Seconds later, there were 3 tiaras in front of him. Now was the tricky part. He cast the Horcrux detecting spell once again and was relieved to find that the 2 duplicates were not in fact Horcruxes. The duplication spell usually did not copy enchantments, but he had no idea how it would handle Horcruxes. He reached down, picked up one of the copies, and handed it to Flitwick. "This is for you, Phileas. It's about time you had your tiara back." Flitwick nodded and stuffed it under his robe. Gingerly, not even daring to touch it with his hands, Snape lifted the Horcrux-tainted tiara off the statue with a wave of his wand. He placed it on the floor in front of him. Picking up the second duplicate, he placed it back on the statue's head. That way, if Voldemort went looking for it, he'd still find it there. If Snape were lucky, he'd never know anything had happened to it. Snape then ordered everyone back. He called for Black to come over with the sword. As Black did so, Snape pointed at the Horcrux in front of him. "When I give the word, take the sword and cut it in 2. That will destroy the Horcrux. Give me a few minutes to seal the door to this room. If there's anything in there which doesn't want to die, we need to make sure it doesn't get out." Black nodded. Snape then turned to the door and sealed it with something only a trained defense against the dark arts professor could break. Satisfied with his spell, he gave the signal to Sirius. Sirius raised the sword. The other professors slowly backed off. The sword came crashing down onto the tiara, cutting it cleanly in 2. A horrible shriek burst from the metal, tearing at people's ears. Its echoes faded away quickly as the tiara, amazingly, began to disintegrate out of its own accord. Snape cast the soul-detecting spell once again. This time, it only detected the humans. He nodded and turned to the rest of the staff. "Mission accomplished. The Horcrux has been destroyed." The searchers cheered and shook each other's hands. One person, however, did not join in the celebration. It was Dumbledore, who said it was premature. 1 down, 4 to go. Chapter 129, Werewolf Pandemic. May 1, 1996, 3 days to full moon Great Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Great Britain next path. 130, ask the fake name generator, and hope it does Russian, Horcruxes left. 4, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Draco Malfoy was troubled. He was happy that Voldemort had returned once again. He thought that he, his father, and the rest of the Death Eaters, he considered himself a Death Eater even though both Voldemort and his father said he wasn't old enough yet, would all be caught once Operation Flying House had killed off most of Voldemort's henchmen. Now that Voldemort had returned and was trying to gain power among the Muggles, he and his family were likely safe. On the other hand, there was the issue of Professor Snape. Draco admired Snape a great deal. He seemed to represent everything Slytherin stood for. The potions master liked him, which was a rarity among the teachers. Draco had been one of the few students invited to the party Snape had thrown when he had finally achieved his dream goal of teaching defense against the dark arts. What was Draco supposed to do now that it was obvious that Snape had been Dumbledore's man all along? Was he supposed to tell Voldemort? If so, how? Was he supposed to take advantage of his relationship with Snape to get close enough to him to kill him? Draco suspected that Voldemort was going to ask him to do that at some point. The mere thought of trying to take out Snape filled him with dread. He doubted he'd be able to win against a trained defense against the dark arts teacher, and he didn't think he'd be able to attack a man he considered a friend. Conceivably, he could ask Crabbe and Goyle to do it, but he didn't think either of those two brutes were smart enough and devious enough to manage to pull it off. He'd spent his free period yesterday studying for his owls and thinking about what to do about his feelings for Snape. He had no idea what had happened yesterday. All he knew was that he had been in the middle of Transfiguration class. Dumbledore had been explaining how to turn a mannequin into frog when Flitwick had stuck his head in and reported, "Albus, we've pinpointed the room." Dumbledore had promptly dropped everything, excused himself, and headed out the door with Flitwick. Draco had then heard at least half a dozen pairs of feet racing down the hall towards the staircase. Right now, all of the teachers were in the room with him. He was in the great hall, having lunch with the rest of the students. He was in his element, as usual. He was getting brownie points among the Slytherins making fun of Harry, a hobby which he had had to abandon for a few months when Harry had been under house arrest. The food was delicious. For some reason, there had been a problem in the kitchen the last few days. The food that the elves had produced seemed to have been a bit messy, as if they had just introduced an elf who didn't know how to cook well yet. Whoever it was must have learned in a hurry, though. Draco was about to bit into his custard pie when an envelope bearing his name fell on top of it. He frowned. He hadn't been expecting mail. He turned it over and looked at the handwriting. It was Lucius's. "To my son, Draco Malfoy. Please open this in private. It involves Lisa Van Papel." Draco froze when he read that. Lisa Van Papel was code for Lord Voldemort. He suspected that Voldemort was going to ask him to do something. Was this the dreaded order to finish off Snape? Excusing himself, he hurried down to his bedroom. Thankfully, no one was missing the meal to read the letter. He opened it with trembling fingers. "My dear Draco, I have just spoken with the Dark Lord, who has taken up temporary residence here at Malfoy Manor. He has told me that he wants you to do something for him. Think of this as a test to see if you are fit to become a full-blown Death Eater. When you are done reading this message, place your right thumb on the dark mark at the bottom of the page, and the message will self-destruct 10 seconds later." The Dark Lord chuckled as I wrote this and said something I don't understand. "Good luck, Jim. I don't get it. If you do, maybe you could explain when you next see me. At any rate, here's what Voldemort wants you to do. Your mission involves Severus Snape." Draco gulped. He wasn't against trying to kill Muggles and mudbloods. However, should he have had some practice killing them before going after his housemaster? He turned back to the letter. "As you are probably aware, Remus Lupin, your third-year defense against the dark arts teacher, is a werewolf. Had it not been for a potion created specifically for him by Professor Snape, the man would transform every month and become a threat to everyone around him. Even Dumbledore would not have permitted Lupin inside the castle had it not been for the support of Professor Snape. Yes, the Dark Lord knows that Snape has betrayed our glorious cause. Rest assured, we will be dealing with him eventually. However, there's still one thing we need him to do first. He won't do it naturally, however, so we would like you to assist us. Our informants tell us that Professor Lupin visits Snape at Hogwarts every day during the week leading up to the full moon. He goes down to Professor Snape's laboratory, where Snape concocts the wolfsbane potion and hands it to him in a special chalice designed for that purpose. The informant has provided a drawing of this chalice, along with this note. Your mission is simple. Full moon is 4 May, this coming Saturday. The weather is supposed to be clear that night. Before that date, you are to master 2 spells using any means possible. The first one is the Portkey spell, which can be used to turn anything into a Portkey. The second is a trigger spell, which will cause a magical effect to take place only when a certain condition has been achieved. I would recommend that you discuss these with Snape or one of the other teachers, and say that you stumbled across them while training for your owls. On the morning of the 4th, before Lupin arrives, you must break into Snape's laboratory. Perhaps you can get yourself a detention with him, and enchant the wolfsbane chalice so that it transports anyone touching it to Wembley Stadium as long as no one other than Lupin is touching it. Wembley Stadium is a Muggle arena known for football matches. It can hold tens of thousands of people. The more people we can find packed into a small area, the better. Apparition out of Hogwarts will not work, as you know. However, Portkeys are a different matter. They will work, I guarantee you that. The plan is elegant. The Portkey is to transport Lupin to a stadium filled with Muggles. Travel by Portkey is rough and turbulent, and the potion will almost certainly spill out completely before he gets to his destination. This will leave him in a populated area without having consumed any wolfsbane. Muggles, of course, have no idea that werewolves actually exist. Before Lupin realizes what is going on, he will be hit by moonlight and transform. He will probably be able to bite several people before his rabid dog form gets killed by Muggle authorities. Your work will accomplish two tasks. First, it will get rid of Lupin, a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Second, it will likely start a lycanthrope pandemic among the Muggles. The Muggles who were bitten by Lupin will have no idea that they've become werewolves as well. They will therefore not be able to warn their friends and family before they transform at the next full moon. The people bitten will therefore bite more people, spreading the pandemic further. Within a year or less, there will be werewolves throughout the Muggle community. The Dark Lord, in his guise as the politician Tom Riddle, will say he knows how to deal with werewolves once he thinks the pandemic has gotten far enough along. That will endear him to the Muggle community even further and get him closer to becoming the Prime Minister. Good luck, Draco. I will look forward to reading the Muggle newspapers on Sunday morning. Your father. Chapter 130, Over My Dead Body. May 1, 1996, 3 days to full moonst. George's cemetery in Horcruxes left. 4, locket, ring, snake, cup. The phone rang in Pavlo Lightplow's office. The cemetery manager wondered who it would be this time and what had finished him off. Usually, it had been people in their 70s and 80s who had died of old age, heart attacks, or other normal conditions. However, there was always the possibility that the deceased had been someone who had been cut down in the prime of his life, possibly in his 30s or 40s. Lightplow had been forced to face this possibility more and more often ever since the Super Bowl breach had introduced the world, as he knew it, to a one populated by wizards. However, nothing had prepared him for the large number of young victims which had suddenly flooded his department over the past week. Most of these victims seemed to have been caught by surprise or shock. In many cases, there were no marks on the body and no obvious cause of death. Lightplow had a suspicion, however, as to what had killed them. Everything boiled down to a strange coincidence involving these victims. All of them were Celestine Catholics. It was well known that the Celestines disapproved of wizards. What he figured was that the victims had tried to attack wizards, and the wizards had been forced to use magic to defend themselves. Much of the area around Elvive was Celestine, after all. That was where the anti-pope had announced his papacy. He hoped the wizards knew what they were doing. At the rate things were going, they were playing right into the Celestines' hands. The Splinter movement could just point at the victims and say that the wizards could not be trusted. He shut the Celestines out of his head and answered the phone. St. George's Cemetery here. How may I help you? A man's voice responded in a crisp, educated Russian accent. Good morning, sir. I have a rather unusual request for you. I hope it won't be too much of a problem. Lightplow's heart sank, probably another dead youngster. Aloud, what's the problem, sir? My name is Leonid Rasputin. I am a descendant of the infamous Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk. Lightplow grunted. He knew Grigory Rasputin, of course. What he hadn't known was that the monk had actually fathered children. Well, live and learn, he thought. Turning back to the phone, he said, I see. What can I do for you, Mr. Rasputin? It will likely be controversial, but bear with me. My uncle recently died, and his estate just announced his will. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Rasputin. We appreciate the sentiment, but we're doing what we can to cope with it. I'm sure you understand. At any rate, my uncle left an unusual request. He wants his extended family's relatives to be buried in his mausoleum. Am I correct in assuming that you have the mad monk's father, Yefim Rasputin, buried in your cemetery? Lightplow turned on the computer. Just a moment, please, let me check. A few minutes later, the results came in. As a matter of fact, Mr. Rasputin, we do have him buried here. The voice on the other end of the line sighed. I thought so. We were wondering if you would be willing to exhume the body so that we would be able to put it in my uncle's mausoleum as per the dead man's will. Lightplow bit his lip. This was most unusual. This is a most unusual request, sir. I'll have to see the will before agreeing to this. I'll also have to determine if the mad monk or any of your other ancestors has stipulated that Yefim Rasputin stay where he is. The voice didn't seem concerned. I understand, sir. However, we've checked. We've got the documents in front of us as well. None of them seem to have any language which will deny my uncle's claims. If you wish, we will bring them over for your inspection, so you can look them over before agreeing to exhume the body. Lightplow nodded. I'd appreciate that. What's your schedule for the rest of the week? The voice replied, I can come in today if you wish. This afternoon would actually work pretty well for me. Lightplow thought this was damned peculiar. However, he'd seen worse. All right, you can start by this afternoon with the documents. My name is Pavlo Lightplow. You can ask for me. 5 hours later, Lightplow stepped outside as the three black-garbed men with briefcases got out of their car. They seemed to be extremely wealthy and educated. One of them, who appeared to be the leader, looked a lot like the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas Roman II Romanov. Lightplow figured that Grigory Rasputin would probably be rolling over in his grave when he found that people who looked like the former Tsar were going to exhume him. The Nicholas Roman II lookalike stepped forward. Good afternoon, Mr. Lightplow. I'm Leonid Rasputin, and these are my cousins. As promised, here are the papers I told you I would provide. Lightplow took the papers and shook all three men's hands. I'm sorry to hear about your uncle, Mr. Rasputin. Is there anything I can do to help? Rasputin, also known as His Grace, Wizard Igor Romanov, but Lightplow had no way to know this, shook his head. Again, thank you for your support, but we have to grieve and get through this. I'm sure someone in your position can understand. All I can suggest is that you look at these documents, verify their authenticity, and exhume the body for us. Lightplow took the documents and spent a good hour looking over them. Amazingly enough, they all appeared to be in order. Nothing in the wills, including Grigory's, seemed to preclude the dead uncle's wishes. He didn't like the idea of disturbing the dead man's rest, but there was nothing he could really do. Returning the papers to Rasputin, he called up the gravediggers and told them to exhume the body. As soon as the sunlight hit the coffin, something happened. Lightplow couldn't put a finger on what exactly it was, but he could have sworn that a flash of orange light shot into the air from the top of the coffin. He shook his head. He must have probably imagined it. However, it was obvious that the mourners had seen it as well. They looked very nervous and shocked. He wondered what it was for a moment, but eventually shrugged it off and resumed the excavation. Half an hour later, Yefim Rasputin's coffin was lying on the surface. Much to Lightplow's horror, the mourners lifted the lid just long enough for the cemetery manager to see a few bones. They then tightened their lips somberly and closed the lid. Lightplow told them to hold on for a moment as he went back into the cemetery office to get some papers for them to sign. It took a while for him to find the papers. He hadn't had to deal with an exhumation for a while, but find them he did. Papers in hand, he opened the door leading to the graveyard, took one look outside, and froze in his tracks. Multicolored beams of light were flashing across the cemetery. The mourners had apparently been wizards. He could see the wands in their hands. Not trying to attract attention, he whistled silently to himself. He'd never met wizards before, but the more he thought about Rasputin, the more he figured that the mad monk could have been a wizard. The mourners seemed to be fighting a bunch of black-clad, wild-looking men with long beards. The second group of men, also wizards, were shouting slogans about a black guard and inventing derogatory slogans about Nicholas Roman II and his family. One of the black guard men took a green bolt in the chest, fell to the ground, and didn't move. The victim's body looked like it could have been one of the young men who had been died over the past week. Wizards on both sides hid behind tombstones. The tombs, however, didn't provide much protection against the multicolored bolts. Lightplow watched as one of them shattered as a yellow beam hit it. That did it, he thought. He didn't know who most of the people buried in the cemetery were, but he knew sacrilege when he saw it. Screaming at both parties in outrage, he told everyone to stop what they were doing immediately. That proved to be a mistake, as one of the Black Guard faction pointed his wand at him and shot a red bolt at him. Lightplow shrieked and ducked just in time. The red bolt hit the calendar above his head, burning a hole through May 23rd. What the hell was going on here? He reached for the telephone to call the police when he heard someone shout, "Evanesco." He looked up just in time to see Yefim Rasputin's coffin vanish, taking the body with it. He started calling the cops. Midway through, however, he noticed that the battle had stopped. The Black Guard people were screaming in horror and anger. The mourners, oddly enough, looked quite smug. He couldn't imagine what they were happy about. Someone had made Yefim Rasputin's body disappear. The only possible explanation was that the mourners had transported the body to the mausoleum using magic. They wouldn't have destroyed their own relative's body. He finished dialing the cops and started speaking to the dispatcher. Looking up once more into the graveyard, he was astonished to find that both groups of men had vanished. All that was left was the dead Black Guard person, lying the way he had fallen. This was just too crazy. He explained the situation to the cops, and the cops said they'd come right over. When they arrived, they couldn't explain what had happened. Lightplow recounted the battle between the wizards, and they reluctantly admitted that this could have been a magical duel. They saw the dead Black Guard man, but they had no idea who the Black Guard was. Lightplow eventually gave them descriptions of as many of the combatants as he could and stepped out of the way as they photographed the corpse on the ground. The cops then cordoned off the area around the body and began their investigation. Lightplow knew only one thing for certain. He'd have to bury another young man again with no obvious mark on his body. Chapter 131, Fard Imperiust. May 2, 1996, 2 days to full moon main audience chamber royal palace Riyadh Saudi Arabia Ukraine Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. King Fard had been fascinated by Amram Rikpreet. He'd never met a Hindu before, let alone someone from as far away as India. He appeared to be an extremely pleasant and intelligent young man. That false impression, however, had been shattered by one word, Imperio. The king didn't know what the word meant. However, he knew that ever since Rikpreet pointed his wand at him and spoken it, Fard had seemed to lose all sense of self. He started developing all sorts of strange and disturbing thoughts, many of which were anathema to Muslims. He tried to convince himself that these thoughts were inappropriate. However, something inevitably popped into his mind that convinced him that the heretical thoughts were in fact all right. It had taken him a couple of days to realize that Amram Rikpreet was likely an evil wizard. Wizard presumably had the power to brainwash people, especially people who weren't familiar with magic. Unfortunately, knowing that he was being brainwashed wasn't of any help when it came to trying to beat off Rikpreet's ideas. He had nearly managed to break free once. He had just been on the verge of calling for Dagher and asking him to remove the curse when Rikpreet, sensing that he was losing control over the king, gave him another dosage of the imperious curse. The rebellion stopped rather quickly. He made a mental note to himself to expel all non-Muslim wizards from his kingdom as soon as returned back to his old self. He just hoped that he wouldn't be forced to forget this idea before that time. He wrenched himself back to the present correction. Rikpreet wrenched him back to the present, and focused on the situation at hand. The diabolical Hindu had convinced him to grant an audience to no fewer than 25 people who looked, for the most part, to be from India. Some of them, thankfully, were Muslim. Others, however, were not and would have warranted further scrutiny had he been able to control his own behavior. One of them, oddly enough, was a woman who was wearing clothing which should have got her stoned. Allah, however, had not seen fit to give him the opportunity to administer the punishment. The only thing that the 25 people had in common was a tattoo on their arms, which seemed to be a skull with a snake coming out of its mouth. Rickpreet himself had a similar tattoo. He knew that anyone with such a tattoo was going to be a problem. He wished he could have done something about it. He suddenly found himself turning to the man lying prostrate nearest to him. He was actually Caucasian and spoke with a precise British accent. What was his name again? The next thing he knew, he was looking at Rickpreet. The traitorous counselor had a grin on his face. Rickpreet bowed and spoke. His name is Rodolphus Lestrange, Your Majesty. You should be able to remember him pretty easily because he's the only European in the room. Fard recognized the name. Something deep down inside told him that Lestrange was one of the nastiest of the bunch. However, Rickpreet's directives neatly brushed the thought aside. Instead, the king smiled at the Brit and told him to rise to his knees. Lestrange did so, and the king make that Rickpreet began to speak. Welcome, my loyal allies. I have been informed about your unusual capabilities as wizards, and after discussion with my chief of staff here, have decided to welcome you into the service of my kingdom. All 25 of you are to be treated as members of the royal family, as long as you are here. The tattooed men he tried to pointedly ignore. The woman thanked him and pressed their heads further into the carpets. Something told him that tattoos were haram, but for some reason that didn't click. To ensure your safety in a land which is not entirely comfortable with wizards yet, I have issued 25 decrees, in writing, which will give you carte blanche to do anything you wish in my name. Anyone who interferes with you will risk the wrath of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The decrees will give you diplomatic immunity wherever you go and allow you access to many important political figures. He reached for the topmost copy of the carte blanche document and signed it. Turning to the kneeling man in front of him, he told the man to rise so he could hand over the document. Shaking the man's hand, he asked Lestrange to tell everyone what his mission was going to be. The man responded promptly. My mission, Your Majesty, is to contact the man in charge of Hamas and ask if they need any assistance in their struggle against their Zionist oppressors. 3 of these wizards will be accompanying me, wizards Hari, Damil, and Hagdi. If my mission is successful, Hamas will be under the control of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You will increase your power and prestige greatly. What do you think of that, Your Majesty? Fard blinked. I think it's a ridiculous idea, you swine of shaitan. The Israelis. That was about as far as he got before his mind went blank and a smile appeared on his face. He replied, I agree with that plan wholeheartedly and pray that Allah goes with you. Lestrange bowed once more. May he go with you as well. He risked a glance at Rickpreet out of the corner of his eye. The man was smiling. Fard understood what the man was thinking. Allah would be the only power able to help you here, and that would be a long shot. He found himself giving the document to Lestrange, who bowed and stepped aside. He then told the next man to come to his knees. The man explained how he would be serving the kingdom's interests by speaking with Hezbollah. Chapter 132. Dueling Advertisements. May 3, 1996. One day to full moon 10 Downing Street, London, England. Horcruxes left. 4. Locket, ring, snake, cup. Text of the Prime Minister's speech to the nation. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have come before you tonight to advise you of some urgent information which has just come across my desk, courtesy of Wizard Rufus Scrimgeour, the Minister of Magic. On the morning of 16 April, a man named Tom Riddle appeared on television all over the country. He introduced himself to the community and announced the foundation of the Alliance for Magic, a political party which is dedicated to the possibility that wizards and muggles can live in harmony. He claimed that many wizards believe that they are superior to muggles and see ordinary folk like you and me only as servants or slaves. Minister Scrimgeour admitted to me, much to his shame, that this is indeed the case. There is indeed a movement among the wizards which seeks to control muggles through magic. In that sense, Mr. Riddle is correct. What Riddle did not tell you, however, is that he the leader of that movement. My fellow Britons, Mr. Riddle is trying to deceive you. Realizing that you do not know about his true nature, he is trying to take advantage of your ignorance and catapult himself into high political office. According to the latest surveys, 6% of Britons have endorsed the Alliance for Magic, and the number continues to climb daily. Minister Scrimgeour is absolutely convinced that if you continue to support this man, there may be a time where Riddle decides that he's achieved his goal of supreme power and turns the table on you, enslaving you, me, and the rest of the British community. I will now relinquish the floor to Minister Scrimgeour so he can tell you more information about Wizard Riddle. First, some background. Rufus Scrimgeour, 53, began his career as an aura, the wizarding equivalent of a police officer. There were times where he risked his life to protect wizards, and in some cases, people like us as well, though we didn't know it from the diabolical schemes of evil wizards. He believed that if the people unfamiliar with magic fell prey to people like Riddle, the nation would suffer greatly. He became Minister of Magic earlier this year, after his predecessor, Cornelius Fudge, was ousted over one of the incidents involving Tom Riddle. Scrimgeour has vowed that he won't let Riddle's power, charisma, and reputation interfere with what needs to be done. Scrimgeour attended the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, as did most wizards in the kingdom. He was a member of Gryffindor House and was an excellent student. He was made prefect in his 5th year and got a position in the Auror office immediately after graduation. This, my fellow Britons, is a very talented man. So, with no further ado, Wizard Rufus Scrimgeour. Good evening, citizens of the United Kingdom. I have come to speak on your community's public address system to warn you about the real nature of Tom Riddle, the politician behind the Alliance for Magic movement. I have dealt with Riddle before, and he is not who he claims he is. Riddle is a very famous and powerful man in the wizarding community. Unfortunately, he has achieved this fame for all the wrong reasons. He is better known, at least to us, by the title Lord Voldemort. He is the head of a group called the Death Eaters, an elitist group of wizards who seek to purify the wizarding community by subjugating the Muggles and weeding out wizards with Muggles as parents. You can identify a Death Eater by a distinctive tattoo on their right arm. Here is a drawing of it. It looks like something from a gang or something like that, but it's not. It's a skull with a snake coming out of its mouth. When Tom Riddle touches the tattoo of a Death Eater with his wand, every single Death Eater receives the message and comes to listen to his advice. This has not been Voldemort's first try for power. Back in the late 70s, he launched a bid to take over the wizarding community via intimidation and coercion. I was an Auror at the time, and rest assured that it was an extremely difficult struggle for us. He and his henchmen killed many innocent people, and would have likely succeeded had it not been for the heroic sacrifice of wizards Lily and James Potter. They gave their lives to prevent their infant son Harry, the same boy responsible for the Super Bowl breach, from being killed by Voldemort. Voldemort's killing curse backfired when it hit Harry, hit Voldemort himself, and banished him to a place which we know as Limbo. Normally, Voldemort would have been killed by such a curse. However, Voldemort is extremely difficult to kill. A resident of Limbo, who will remain nameless, was of invaluable support in helping explain Voldemort's resilience. The Ministry of Magic is working to see what it can do to rectify that situation. Back in March, the Ministry performed a clandestine operation which eliminated most of the Death Eaters and sent Voldemort back to Limbo. That gave us some time to consider the problem. Unfortunately, his henchmen brought him back a month later, the day before he launched his political campaign. I would like to emphasize how difficult the struggle against Voldemort was. Many trained Aurors were killed. I know, the Muggle community didn't know about it and wasn't affected. However, the only reason the Muggles weren't affected was because the statute of secrecy was still intact at the time. Now, with the statute of secrecy gone, Voldemort considers you fair game. This is why I am warning you today. My fellow Britons, do not go anywhere near Tom Riddle and do not support the Alliance for Magic. Furthermore, if you ever see a snake witch, momentary static appears on the screen. Good evening, my fellow Britons. This is Tom Riddle speaking. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe it is important to join this conversation. Like all of you, I have been paying attention to Prime Minister's speech. I would like to comment on what I've been hearing. When I first introduced myself 2 weeks ago, I warned you that many wizards were elitist. I warned you that many people in the Ministry of Magic didn't like what I planned to do and would try to think up schemes to get me into trouble. My friends, do not listen to Minister Scrimgeour. He's the head of Wizarding Movement, for crying out loud. He's in a position whose prestige would suffer greatly if the Muggle community and Wizarding community merged. What use is it being the minister for a few thousand people when you've basically come under the thumb of the Prime Minister, a rule of millions, and in all fairness the true ruler of our land? As far as Prime Minister Major goes, you have to understand that the Prime Minister may be under the influence of Wizard Scrimgeour. It's considered a dark art, but it is possible for one wizard to brainwash an unsuspecting victim. Our Prime Minister may not be acting on his own accord here. Needless to say, you don't want someone brainwashing the most powerful man in the country. For all we know, Scrimgeour may be fabricating this to trying to be elected Prime Minister himself, where he'll just ignore you once he's in office. Minister Scrimgeour is correct in that Lord Voldemort indeed existed. I remember Voldemort and thought he was dead. However, I now know that he survived, much to my surprise. How do I know? His real name is Rufus Scrimgeour. He won't tell you this, but you need to be member of the Wizarding House of Lords in order to be Minister of Magic. Some Magna Carta, ha! His grandfather's barony was Valdemar. If you're wondering if the name sounds similar to that of Voldemort, it does, and for a good reason. As far as the tattoo goes, he's misleading you once again. The people with the tattoos are the Aurors, not the Death Eaters. They coalesced as a magical fighting unit in Vietnam and used their troops' insignia as a recognition aid. They have experience fighting bad guys, and it shows. Remember this, people of Britain. Tattoos are good. Scrimgeour is figuring that if you Muggles take out the cops, he and the Death Eaters will have complete control of the wizarding world, and eventually, Britain. I would know, citizens of Britain. My father was a Muggle. I'm not a pureblood like Scrimgeour, and I'd have no chance to even get into their House of Lords. And if I didn't have a chance, would you? He's old school, Minister Scrimgeour. The time of ignoring Muggles is gone. The wizards need new leadership, at the very least, and Voldemort should be thrown in jail. My fellow Britons, I want to break this impasse as much as you do. As a result, I was wondering if we could have a talk between Minister Scrimgeour and me and the Prime Minister, alone, all in the same room. Let's get this hammered out once and for all. I, Tom Riddle of the Alliance for Magic, am not chicken. Minister Scrimgeour, are you? Do you have the guts to tell everyone the truth? Or will you just decide to not accept my invitation and imply that you're not the generous man you think you are? Citizens of Britain, I apologize for the inconvenience. May God save the Queen. More static. Will not rest until Voldemort is dead, and dead for good.